Welcome to the annual meeting session 4 on regulatory. My name is Marco Schito. I'm the executive director for the Cure Drug Repurposing Collaboratory, and I wanted to kick this session 4 off with a little bit of introduction and goals of the work group that will be met for today. So in this welcome, our overall goals and objectives of this regulatory, legislative, and policy working group is really to reach out to experts and interested participants who are interested in drug repurposing in general, and especially for some of these more lofty regulatory and legislative and policy working group goals. The discussion has been initially with regulators and academics, and that has been to really try to frame what our goals are going to be, and to ensure that we articulate the value proposition with other stakeholders who include other nonprofit organizations, societies, CMS, insurers, manufacturers, patients, and the list goes on. So we want to be as inclusive, but we also want to ensure that we understand what each one of these stakeholders can bring to the table. And so what are the common challenges that we have? What's the scope of the problem? Who is doing what? And that's where I think a lot of the conversations will occur, both from the presentations that will follow, as well as the discussions. How can we engage best with other stakeholders? And we have a number of individuals who will be participating here. And is there a common goal that we can align on? Can we establish the mechanisms to share that information, define incremental milestones, and then determine timelines? So the CDRC RLP working group is led by Dr. David Simon and myself, and there are a number of other individuals who have been participating over the past, I would say, 4 or 5 months, to discuss, how to bring this work group together a little bit more. And it includes not only regulators, such as FDA, Health Canada, MHRA, as well as academics and NIH, as well as other groups such as the Anti-Cancer Fund, which are the nonprofit organizations. So really this is dictated on drug labels. We want to define the indication for use that a sponsor sought, and the US FDA approved based on those evidentiary standards. This allows really the sponsor, who is the main benefactor for drug labeling, by the way, to market the drug. And the labels can be updated only by the NDA holder through a number of different ways, and this is specific for FDA. But the sponsor may be interested in label expansion, usually from a financial perspective. Oftentimes, it may not necessarily totally be financial, and they will want to explore that a little bit further or not. Is there an interest in repurposed drugs by the company itself? That's a question, and the rationale for certain companies to explore drug repurposing and to expand their labels are just as varied as the number of companies that are out there. So what we're talking about here is drug repurposing. And this is, by definition, the investigation of an existing drugs for its new therapeutic purposes. And that's really to maximize the effectiveness of our current arsenal of drugs, which are quite narrow. We have a drug, we have a disease, and that's usually where the connections are made. But there are a couple of different ways in which drug repurposing can work. It can have a drug that targets this shared pathway. So in this case, the biological target of that drug or molecule is the same, but it's for the same in 2 different types of diseases. An example of this is remdesivir, which was originally designed for HCV and then was tested for Ebola, and then actually was approved for COVID. There may be other ways in which drugs can be effective through off-target pathways. This is a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more difficult, but drugs oftentimes do act on multiple different targets. And some of these new targets are out of actually the original scope of the indication. And so this could be used for a new therapeutic indication. A little bit more complicated, nuanced, as I said, but for example, aspirin has traditionally been used as a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. for a treatment of pain and other inflammatory disorders, but it also suppresses blood coagulation and clot formation by inhibiting the normal function of platelets. So that's two different mechanisms of the same drug. Just earlier this year in the Journal of Pharmaceutical Policy and Practice, there was a paper published that talks about the new uses of repurposed drugs. And this group did sort of an extensive review of the exclusivity granted by US FDA for drugs approved over the past 23 years. And in essence, what they have indicated that within the first 2 years of a new molecular entity coming onto the market, that's usually the peak in which new indications are often sought by the sponsor. In that 7 to 8 years prior to generic entry, you start seeing a precipitous drop in the number of applications that are submitted to regulatory authorities, in this case FDA. And of the 197 new drugs that subsequently experienced generic entry, only about 32%, that's around 64, actually had at least one new indication added to the label. So there is a lot more room for improvement, is the bottom line for unlocking the existing medicine's full potential therapeutic potential. And so this leads now to the 21st Century's Cures Act, which is a framework in which the FDA then developed their real-world evidence program to establish a program, essentially, to evaluate the potential use for real-world evidence to support a number of different aspects. The approval of new indications, the approval of a label expansion, and then sort of the post-marketing commitment to satisfy post-approval study requirements. And the program is based on a framework that, first of all, categorizes the sources of real-world evidence and gaps in data collection activities, for example, the quality, identifies standards and methodologies for collection and analysis, and describes priority areas, remaining challenges and potential pilot opportunities that the program will address. So a number of efforts that are moving forward over the past few years and into the future. Now, similar programs are being implemented across most global regulatory agencies, including Health Canada, the MHRA in the UK, in England, as well as the TGA in Australia. And all three of these stringent regulatory authorities will be presenting, as will the FDA in this session. The question that we also wanted to ask more ostensibly is really, do we need a label change? Without sponsor support, there's really no way to engage regulators. There are obviously potential incentives. There's a financial incentive, but if that financial incentive isn't there enough, then there are other incentives such as the orphan drug designation or utilizing of legislative power of the Best Practices in Children Act. And if this does not occur, well, what happens is that the drug continues to be used off-label. So what's the consequence of that? Oftentimes people say, you know, that's fine. What's the point? Well, the point here is that safety and effectiveness really remains to be a concern. We really don't know. It's not met to the same degree, and there are questions concerning really both the safety and effectiveness of that drug, even though a physician may believe that that drug is working. So over time, what happens is that the drug actually, because of just it being used as a standard of care, it becomes that for that treatment. And as a result, what happens is that there's a loss of equipoise to assess drug safety and efficacy in a randomized clinical trial, because what is your comparator group? You can't now, if that's a standard of care, remove that standard of care to evaluate its effectiveness. So how can we address this loss of equipoise? And that's, I think, where really the power of real-world data can come in place, to be able to supplement and to provide some new level of evidence to suggest whether a particular treatment is actually being effective or not. We can also look at pharmacokinetic bridging studies in certain circumstances. Extrapolation is another example of where we can start taking a look at additional data to be able to support a continued use of a particular drug for that treatment. But the bottom line is that other than having a sponsor to come in, we need a regulatory mechanism that benefits patients and prescribers initially, rather than having a system that is in place really only just for sponsors. And that's really the sustainable infrastructure that we're trying to establish for advancing drug repurposing. And it's really these regulatory goals that allow us to look for newer pathways, looking at potentially ways in which non-traditional pathways have been used. How have other regulatory agencies addressed this, or are they planning on addressing this, or what is their level of evidence that is required for moving the needle forward in many of these aspects? So that's what we're going to be discussing over the course of this session. And I thank you for your time. And if you are interested and willing to participate, we also are welcoming any of you who have an interest in this to contact us and participate as much as you can. Thank you very much.